Before someone owned it, everyone used it. The history of the modern economy is partly the story of that sentence being reversed, one resource at a time, and the reversal being called progress. That framing contains a real argument and a real counter-argument, and both deserve to be heard before either is accepted. Because the question of what should be held in common and what should be privately owned is not settled by ideology or by history. It is settled, incompletely, temporarily, always contestably, by specific political decisions made in specific conditions, with specific consequences that are only visible from a distance. Start with what the commons actually was, before the concept became a battleground. For most of European agricultural history, land was managed under a system of common rights. Villagers had customary access to shared pastures for grazing livestock, shared forests for timber and firewood, shared fisheries, shared water sources. The commons was not simply unowned land left to anyone who wandered onto it. It was carefully managed under rules developed over generations, rules about who could graze how many animals, when, under what conditions, with what obligations to maintain the resource. The commons was not a vacuum of governance. It was a different kind of governance. Collective, local, embedded in relationships and reputations rather than in formal legal title. This system was not idyllic. It was often inequitable in its own ways, with those who held more animals benefiting more from common grazing. It was less productive per acre than intensive private farming in many cases. It was not a solution to all problems, but it provided something that its replacement did not. It provided a floor. The poorest villager who held rights on the common could graze a cow, gather fuel, supplement their diet in ways that did not require purchasing access from a landlord. The commons was not wealth. It was security, a minimum, the thing you could fall back on when everything else failed. The enclosure movement, which accelerated across England from the 16th through the 19th centuries, replaced this floor with nothing. Land that communities had managed in common was consolidated, fenced, declared private property, and converted to more productive individual use. The gains in agricultural productivity were real. The disruption was also real. People who had sustained themselves in part through common rights found themselves without that sustenance, without alternatives, and without the power to resist what was being done to them. Many moved to cities. Many entered factories. The commons became capital. The commoners became workers. In 1968, the biologist Garrett Hardin published an essay in Science called The Tragedy of the Commons that became one of the most cited and most influential academic papers of the 20th century. Its argument was elegant and appeared to explain everything. Hardin described a shared pasture on which each herder has an incentive to add one more animal, because the benefit of the additional animal accrues to the individual herder, while the cost of the additional grazing is shared across all users. Each herder, acting rationally in their own interest, adds animals until the pasture is destroyed. The tragedy is that rational individual behavior produces collective ruin. The commons is inherently vulnerable to overexploitation because no one has the individual incentive to restrain themselves. The paper's policy implication was direct. Commons should either be privatized, giving someone an individual interest in maintaining the resource, or regulated by external authority capable of enforcing restraint. The commons itself, self-governed collective use, was presented as inherently unstable. The historical record of enclosure and privatization was implicitly rehabilitated. The paper was enormously influential. It shaped environmental policy, development economics, and the ideological framework through which common resources were understood for decades. It also had a significant empirical problem. Elinor Ostrom spent her career looking at actual commons, actual fisheries, forests, grazing lands, irrigation systems that had been managed collectively over decades and centuries without the tragedy Hardin predicted. She found them, many of them, across multiple continents, across multiple historical periods, in conditions of varying wealth and governance capacity. Communities in Switzerland had managed common alpine meadows under stable self-governing arrangements. Japanese villages had maintained common forests under collective management for centuries. Fishing communities in Maine had developed informal governance systems for lobster territories that sustained populations that regulated markets could not have preserved. Ostrom documented the conditions under which communities successfully manage commons. Clearly defined membership, rules matched to local conditions, collective choice about those rules, effective monitoring, graduated sanctions, accessible conflict resolution mechanisms, recognition from external authorities. These conditions are not always present. When they are not, the tragedy Hardin described can occur. But the tragedy is not inherent to collective governance. It is the outcome of specific institutional failures. The institutional form can be designed. It can succeed. In 2009, Ostrom received the Nobel Prize in Economics for this work. She was the first woman to receive it. Her research did not overturn Hardin's insight entirely. Genuine tragedies of the commons occur. The conditions for successful common governance are not always achievable, but it fundamentally changed what the evidence says about the alternatives. The choice is not simply between private ownership and destruction. It is among a range of institutional arrangements, each suited to different conditions, each producing different distributions of benefit and risk. Here is the floor move. The most important commons of the 21st century are not pastures. They are invisible. The atmosphere is a commons. Every emitter of carbon dioxide deposits waste into a shared atmospheric resource without paying for that deposition. The cost is distributed across everyone who breathes air and everyone who will inherit the climate that results. No individual emitter has sufficient incentive to restrain themselves because the benefit of restraint accrues to everyone while the cost falls on the individual restraining. Hardin's structure applies perfectly, but the solution, privatizing the atmosphere, assigning ownership rights to the air, is not coherent. The commons cannot be enclosed. It can only be governed. And the governance of the atmospheric commons has for decades confronted exactly the coordination problem that makes Ostrom's conditions so difficult to achieve at planetary scale. The knowledge commons is a different kind of invisible resource. The accumulated scientific and cultural understanding of humanity, the mathematics, the physics, the medical knowledge, the literature, the techniques that enable everything from surgery to architecture, was built over centuries through the cumulative contributions of people who mostly did not own what they contributed to. It is held, in large part, in common. It is the substrate on which all innovation rests. We saw in the scarcity video how intellectual property law creates manufactured scarcity in this commons, extracting private returns from resources that are in their nature inexhaustible. The formula for a molecule does not wear out with use. The theorem does not deplete when taught. The legal structures that create private ownership of pieces of this commons are designed not to manage genuine scarcity, but to generate revenue from abundance. The enclosure of the knowledge commons is ongoing, and its consequences for who can access the foundations of innovation are significant and unequally distributed. The Internet was, in its early decades, something close to a knowledge commons. Built on publicly funded infrastructure, governed by open protocols, accessible to anyone with a connection, generating a culture of free sharing of information, code, and creative work. That commons has been substantially enclosed. The platforms through which most people now access the Internet are private property. The protocols are controlled by private entities. The content created by users is the raw material from which private companies extract economic value without sharing it with those who created it. The transformation happened over roughly 2 decades and was experienced mostly as a series of conveniences, each of which traded a small piece of the commons for a service that was genuinely useful. The ocean is a commons under threat from multiple directions simultaneously. Fisheries being depleted beyond their regenerative capacity. Plastic waste accumulating in ways no governance structure has effectively addressed. Ocean acidification from atmospheric carbon absorption. The ocean does not belong to anyone and therefore, in the relevant practical sense, belongs to everyone equally, which is another way of saying that the cost of depleting or contaminating it falls on everyone, while the benefit of doing so accrues to whoever is doing it. The tragedy structure is present. The governance capacity to address it is not, These are not separate problems with separate solutions. They are the same structural problem appearing in different domains. The commons, the shared resource that belongs to everyone by no one's individual interest, requires governance that the market cannot provide, and that nation-state structures struggle to provide at planetary scale. The political difficulty of commons governance at scale is real and should not be minimized. International agreements on fisheries have had mixed records. Climate agreements have been negotiated for 30 years with results that serious scientists describe as insufficient relative to the scale of the problem. The failure is not primarily technical. The knowledge of what would be required exists. The institutional capacity to implement it against the interests of powerful actors with incentives to continue exploiting the commons is what is lacking. This is not pessimism, it is description. Describing a problem clearly is the precondition of addressing it. The governance of commons has succeeded in documented cases. It succeeds when the conditions Ostrom identified are present. The project is to create those conditions at the scales where they are needed. Now bring this into the texture of your daily life, not as environmental policy, as something more immediate. The clean air in your city is a commons. The quiet of your neighborhood before traffic or commercial noise colonized it was a commons. The sense of shared public space, the park, the library, the sidewalk, the public beach is a commons. The network of civic trust that allows you to leave your door unlocked, to expect that someone will help you in an emergency, to feel that you are not alone in a society of strangers, that is a commons. Each of these is under pressure, not from the tragedy Hardin described, from overuse by people acting in their short-term interest without governance, from something more deliberate, from the gradual privatization and commercialization of shared space, from the withdrawal of public investment in shared infrastructure, from the replacement of common resources with purchased access to private substitutes. The park that is underfunded becomes the gym membership. The public library that is defunded becomes the subscription service. The commons is not being destroyed by its users. It is being enclosed by those who see correctly that there is money to be made from converting common resources into market transactions. The person who pays for a gym because the public park has deteriorated is not making a free market choice. They are paying to access through a private market something that was once common and has been made scarce. The transaction is real, the freedom in it is partial. What you hold in common with the people around you, the shared resources, the shared spaces, the shared air, the accumulated knowledge, the civic fabric, is not simply infrastructure. It is the material of what it means to live among other people rather than alongside them. Something is being lost. It is being lost gradually enough that each step feels like a small adjustment. But the cumulative direction is visible if you stand back far enough to see it. What in your daily life exists because no one owns it, and what has disappeared or is disappearing because someone decided to.